It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Dr. Loumagne Ulishney is an assistant professor of systematic theology in the theology department at Boston College. Her work engages questions at the intersection of Catholic theology, the sciences, and feminist philosophy and theology. She is currently working on a grant project that is funded by the John Templeton Foundation entitled Spiritual Naturalisms, Nature, Spirituality, and Ecological Activity Among the Spiritual but Not Religious. This project examines the rise of nature spirituality among the spiritual but not religious, the ways in which theology may play implicit roles in nature spirituality, and the relevance of nature spirituality for creation care. Welcome, Dr. Ulishney.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I know that it's such a busy time in the semester, and we're all frantically hurtling towards the finish line here. So I appreciate that it's a sacrifice to come here in the middle of your busy day. So thank you so much, and it encourages my heart to see you all here. So thank you. As you can see, and as Maddie mentioned, this is a grant-funded project by the John Templeton Foundation. I'm sort of right in the middle of the project, so maybe you'll notice that a little bit in the presentation that I haven't come to established conclusions and everything yet, but what I'll try to show is what I've been getting up to with the activities of the project, and then some of the hopes of the project, and then where I'm developing some of the ideas, some of the tools that I'm using to develop some of the ideas, and I have, I think, a sense of where some of those will go, but it's not finalized yet, so don't hold me to it necessarily, but I think I'll be able to give a good sense. I was on maternity leave last semester, so it slowed the progress a little bit on the project, as it should. As I'll mention, I did all these visits to the wild churches, and as you would guess from the name, they're often like out in the middle of a forest, or so you can imagine me maybe 9 months pregnant, and my husband being like, "Is this really something that you should be doing right now?" And I was like, "I mean, it's fine. I'm sure there's a hospital nearby. Not always cell reception, but yeah, some of the instructions to come to them would be like, okay, at this point you will lose cell reception. Drive up the muddy road and very slowly, and then when you get to this tree, make a left." And it was a little bit anxiety producing, but I had planned to do 10 visits to these wild churches, mostly in the Northeast, just in consideration of my ecological footprint, and that was something that I really wrestled with this project. Is a lot of this is wanting to protect nature, to conserve nature, and I didn't want to be flying all over the U.S. trying to celebrate that. So I was planning to do 10, and then with my pregnancy, I ended up doing 6 visits with the idea that I can fit in a few more if we need to as we look at the data. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about some goals of the project, and then the activities, and then where the ideas are developing. So where I'm coming from as a theologian is to look at how theology is being used. I think what I've found initially is that most of the time, not always, most of the time, this is implicit ways that theology is being used. So many of the wild churches were very reluctant to talk about theology, didn't really like even considering the terms. They told me that we think this is about the felt experience of the heart, and it's not primarily concerned with a theological system. At the same time, I think that there was quite a bit of theology that was being used to make sense of nature spirituality. So I'm really trying to kind of pull that apart and think through that a little bit. And so I'll talk a bit more about how I do that. It's also, in addition to what I'm bringing as a theologian, I'm partnering with a psychologist, a wonderful person. I have a picture of her on the next slide, I think, Dr. Helga Sindvag Lovel, who is based in Norway. So we actually hadn't met in person when she agreed to do this project. So big leap of faith on her part that I'm sane and have a good project that will go somewhere. But we were connected through a mutual friend. She is a professor of what's called friluftsliv studies in Norway. And from what I understand, that sort of loosely translates into English as free air living. And so friluftsliv is a kind of sort of like a national value, national spirituality almost in Norway. And so she studies this in the university context and also especially studies the impact of nature experiences on young people, especially marginalized young people. So she has all these exciting things she's doing, of going to live in an Arctic igloo for 3 weeks with young people. And she was telling me this story about how she had to learn how to fire a rifle because they might encounter a polar bear and she might need to shoot it. And, so she's a very small person, and so she said this rifle is like as big as she was. And so as you can see, very different research tools that we're using in different experiences, but she's been a great, I don't have any rifles with me, don't worry. She's been a great conversation partner, and she's really thoughtful. She's very curious and very open to theology, which is not always the case with people in the psychological sciences, but I think she really just wants to come to deeper understanding of nature spirituality and thinks that theology has something to offer, which I appreciate. So yeah, one of the goals then is sort of partnering with her to bring psychology and spirituality, theology together to understand what's happening with nature spirituality. There she is, Dr. Helga. She was here, so most of our conversations have been over Zoom. In November, she came out here for a week. So we had a week where we just spent big portions of every day. I brought my 4-month-old because he was just 4 months at the time. And we would just do walks around the reservoir and talk about what we want to do with the project and what we're seeing in the data. And that was a really generative time for us. And we should hopefully have another chance to get together in the summer. So we have done some data collection. So we developed a questionnaire, which was a set of instruments that are used in the psychological sciences that have been sort of validated as instruments that are pretty effective. And so these are meaning of life questions. Let's see, what else did we have in there? We had ecological behaviors. This is also something that we're thinking through, like what's the connection between nature spirituality and actual practices? Does having a sense of nature spirituality make an impact on how people are actually behaving? So are they going to recycle more, or are they willing to pay more for organic products because of their nature spirituality? These sorts of questions. So we had about a 15-minute survey that I initially would hand out in a paper format, but then some of the weather sometimes when I went to the wild churches was not necessarily something where people wanted to sit out for an extra 30 minutes and fill out a survey. So at the one I went to in Vermont, which I'll show some pictures of, was freezing. It was like a year ago, and it was freezing cold, and everyone was such good sports, so they're like, shivering trying to answer these surveys, and we decided to switch to a digital survey. But yeah, we can talk about some of the positives or negatives of those, but we made that shift. I had an interdisciplinary workshop that I held here also in November, where we had some theologians, some psychologists as well, people specializing in spirituality here over at Connolly House to have some conversations together around some of the themes. And then we're hoping to co-publish some things together in both psychology and journal articles, and then eventually with the hope that a book will emerge. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about something called the Wild Church Network. I see the Wild Church Network as, I phrase it as a case study where I don't see the whole grant project as being about the Wild Church Network. I see it as being much broader than that, where I want to think about nature spirituality in general. But I think the Wild Church Network is a nice place to do these sort of concrete investigations because, as you can see, this is just the front page of their website. They specifically want to use nature as a sort of spiritual practice. Initially, as you heard in the description from Maddie, the project was pitched as a study of the spiritual but not religious. It's been a little bit complicated, which I can talk about a little bit more, just because what I've found in going to many of these wild churches is that many, but not all of them, are basically groups of Christians who are outside of maybe traditional institutional participation. Many of them are former Catholics or were formerly part of a denomination and now have decided to leave. Sometimes there's religious trauma, but in many of them, it was often basically a Christian framework that they were using, which has led to me wrestling with, like, to what extent am I studying the spiritual but not religious, and to what extent am I just studying sort of disaffiliated Christians. There's one that I visited that I can show a picture of in Massachusetts that was more Buddhist, I would say, in their orientation, and they said, like, we specifically we are not theological, like we are not Christian. We don't want to be associated with Christian theology. So that one was a little bit more overt, but in many of the others, sometimes they're connected to a denomination. So there's one in Wellesley that I went to where they're part of United Church of Christ. There's some Mennonite ones, actually quite a few Mennonite ones, and so they have a very explicit Christian theology. Okay, I have a couple more things to share about the Wild Church Network, which is just, so it was founded by two sisters, which also the gender angle is something that I'm interested in kind of exploring that. So Victoria Lortz and Valerie Luna Searles are the name of the sisters. They co-founded this, the Wild Church Network, and this is just a quote from their website, to be a network of communities that invite people into intimate relationship with some of the most vulnerable victims of our destructive culture, the land, waters, and creatures with whom we share our homes. And so they envision these spaces as places to reconnect with the natural world as kin, and really trying to, like, in the concrete, develop these sort of kinship relationships. There's definitely a forwarding of the sacredness of nature, so nature is seen as sacred. They describe these communities as beloved co-participants in a larger story of grace and interbeing. I should mention as well that I spoke with Victoria and Valerie at the beginning of the project just to meet them and also have them have a sense of what I was getting up to. So I wanted to avoid this sense that there's this person like lurking around and I'm trying to study them. And I also was encouraged by a psychologist friend to invite them to be part of the research design, which I think was really, I'm grateful for that advice. So I was able to ask them, what are the questions that you think that I should be asking as I am studying the wild churches? And, you know, what do you see as your own purpose? And then how have you seen the evolution of what's happening with the wild churches? So they both were really enthusiastic. What I found with all the wild churches was actually just a sense of gratitude that somebody cared enough to come and think about what they're doing and valued what they're doing. Also a little bit of like, what is a systematic theologian? Why do you call yourself that? Which was kind of, that was funny. So, okay, yeah, so I went to 6 locations, as I mentioned, all basically in the Northeast. We have received 39 responses so far to the survey. According to Helga, this is enough that we can do something with this in terms of publishing an article, but we do hope to get some more, and then I'm planning to do interviews once all the approvals are through the grants office here. So here's just a few pictures of some of my visits. So this is the one in Wellesley. The one in Wellesley, as you would imagine, this probably tracks with if you know anything about Wellesley. It was basically a small patch of grass surrounded by mansions. So yeah, people sort of came to this seeking wildness and seeking connection with nature in this space. And this is part of the ritual where they invited people to share if they were carrying something that they wanted to leave behind. They could share a rock or a pebble into the bowl of water, or if they had something joyful that they were thinking of, they could set a flower into the water. So often there were these rituals. There really was, as I would call it, a sort of Catholicity to the wild churches, where a small c Catholicity, they do follow a sort of very similar liturgy in a sense, a sort of opening invocation or a blessing, some sort of inspiration or something to ruminate on. Lots of Mary Oliver poems. They described her as the closest thing to a saint for the wild churches. And then a sort of sending out into a wandering time. So they all have this wandering time, which is seen as, I think, the like the center of the wild church meetings. Sometimes these were 15 minutes, sometimes they were 45 minutes, where people go and sometimes given instructions like just to notice or to try to connect with a being that is non-human, something along these lines, and then to come back together and have a sharing time and a sort of final blessing. The one in Wellesley, as I mentioned, that one was a little bit more, well, much more explicitly Christian as well. This is the one in Vermont. So this was on a homestead. So as soon as I had no cell reception, and I hadn't warned my husband ahead of time that I wouldn't have cell reception. So I was sort of like, well, oh well, he'll figure out that I was okay once I get back. It's fine. So yeah, I came out of the car and immediately smelled chickens and all the smells of sort of a farm. And this was a Mennonite community. This one was also interesting because they had some explicit programming for children, which is not super common among the wild churches. All of the wild churches, I would say, one thing I appreciated about them is that they're very welcoming to children in the sense of like letting children be kids and not fussing about it. So it's like kids would sort of be part of it and then go run off and be crazy for a little while and then come back, and everybody's just fine with that. And that was really nice as a parent of small children, just to see how they were sort of valued and affirmed, but also welcomed in to share their insights. So during the wandering time, the kids stayed back with the leader, Heather, of the church, and she had some programming for them as they didn't want the kids to be wandering unless they were with their parents. This was, I was there during Holy Week, actually, about a year ago at this Vermont one. And so they had, what they had done, which was really interesting, was taken many of these symbols and liturgies of Holy Week and kind of recast them in ecological terms. So this is a sort of some homemade pancakes that they had made that they were then dipping in maple syrup that they had taken from one of the local trees. And this was part of the Eucharistic sort of procession. They had this really interesting moment where we actually walked over to the tree and we were invited to look upon the one that we have pierced, the tree that they had taken the maple syrup from. And so it was this way, this sort of invitation to think about how the land gives itself for us. In this kind of Eucharistic language, it gives of itself for our own salvation or our survival. So yeah, that's a very, again, it's very explicit Christian imagery in that one. This one, as you can see, Green Lane, Pennsylvania. This is a husband and wife team. So this was the only one where there was a male who was involved in the leadership of the wild church. But it was still a couple that was doing it together. This was also on their home. They were Mennonite as well, and they had bought this home as sort of intending it to be a retreat center for people. And this one was interesting in that they had many tired pastors who came to this wild church service and found it really a place of, I think, just nourishment and peace. And they felt they had a specific ministry actually to pastors who were coming here. This is the one that was more Buddhist in orientation. So I'm sure I'm going to say this wrong. It's in Montague, Massachusetts. So it's not too far away. Everybody was invited to place a kind of sacred object onto the table. So these are some of the objects that were sacred to people. This is one of the poems that they used in their service. This was in Goochland, Virginia, right next to a big, beautiful river. You can kind of see it in the background there. This was also on some private property, which I thought raised some, the sort of public-private nature of the land is something I hope to explore more in the research. So I can talk more about my conversations with them about that, but this is part of their land and community there. Okay. So I want to mention then a few themes that I see emerging in the research and try to give a sense of how I'm developing these ideas. So it's a work in progress, as I mentioned. Mostly I will focus on how I'm thinking theologically about the issues, as Helga and I are still working on the data evaluation. So she's sent me a big graph with lots of symbols about correlations, and she's going to help me understand what that means in the coming weeks, but we'll do some more of the empirical work soon. In the survey that I sent out, I asked some open-ended questions. That was a fun negotiation between myself and Helga, because all of these psychological instruments are like, rate your response to this on a scale of 1 to 5, and all the questions that I had were open-ended questions that I was interested in, and she kept saying, these are not questions that psychologists ask, but they're questions that a theologian asks. This is where I see this going. I wanted to ask, one of the things I'm interested in is questions about the God-world relationship, how people understand that, and then in a sense how that cashes out, or how that what's the practical import of that, or how does that facilitate or not facilitate the ability to experience nature as spiritual. So I asked some open-ended questions on the survey to see how people think about the God-world relationship. I think I have, some of these might be too small, so I can read those for you, but these are just a few of the responses. when I asked about people how they think about the divine in relation to nature. So one person said, I believe either spirit goddess is very, very closely knit together with nature, or is nature, including my own body. I am part of the universe. There is no universe over there with me off to the side, and there's no big man in the sky with a gray beard pulling levers. And I don't need a religious organization designating chieftains who will guide me to access to the divine. I can find direct access to the divine, and being in nature helps me put aside the factors that could interfere with that, like thinking about tomorrow's meeting or today's traffic, but rather putting me in a receptive place for finding the divine that is already there in me. Everything that exists is a manifestation or facet of the divine. Nature is continually offering us the opportunity to open to the presence of the divine and allow radiant love to flow through us. Every being or manifestation is a potential doorway into love, the recognition or felt awareness of God. Nature is a part of creation. So here you see more of the Christians explicitly thinking about creation. An amazing ordering of molecules, most incredible to me in our little blue planet Earth. What an incredible gift it is to be on Earth here today, conscious of both nature and myself. How could anyone not have gratitude? How could one not thank God? And then this final one, it's all God, and there is no thing that is not. So yeah, what I found in the wild churches is really a mix, I would say, of how people think about that. You can see it represented here in the slide. Some, I think, have a more traditional Christian conception of creation. Some have something that's a little bit more like pantheism, I think, where it's just nature is worshipped in itself, nature is divine. So yeah, again, the question that I'm pursuing along these lines is, what is the relationship between certain background pictures of reality or implicit theologies? So Charles Taylor uses this term ontic commitments. So what are ontic commitments that people have that might enable them to experience nature as spiritual? So then the capacity to experience nature in a spiritual way, I think, depends upon a certain world picture or a system of reference that resources that experience. I take this world picture to include beliefs about the relationship between the divine and the material, which is what I'm trying to get at here. The exploration is rooted in a foundational epistemological question, I think, which is just about the relationship between beliefs and spirituality. But it also has a specific theological register in this project, in that I'm thinking about specifically this, how beliefs about the God-world relationship influence spirituality. So that's one side of the exploration that I'm doing at the moment. A second point that I'm sort of developing my own writing is thinking about how wildness or wilderness serves as a sort of myth that enables certain spiritual experiences. And what is it that we're doing when we're setting aside a little patch of grass in Wellesley as our wild place, or even a homestead, which is it is land that is worked, and so it's not wild in a sense, but there's a certain myth creation, I think, that happens that then allows for these sort of spiritual experiences. So I'm trying to explore that, not as a means of being judgmental or critical of the communities, but just to try to think through how there might be some unexamined, maybe myths that are connected also with American myths of the frontier, or associations also with wealth and eliteness. So often what I think we can see with sort of wilderness expeditions, and Helga has done some research on this as well, is that it's actually really expensive to be able to explore the wilderness and all the kind of like gear that you need. It has essentially become a sort of elite activity where you have people who live in very urban areas who are tired by that urban experience and want to find refreshment in a sort of constructed nature, which is wilderness. But of course that what we think of as wilderness has been land occupied by people groups for a long time. And so that's a tension I'm kind of exploring. I will say with the wild churches, one thing that I found very touching was I thought that they were more intentional than I expected them to be honest, at acknowledging indigeneity and the populations that had lived on that land. And so every wild church that I went to, without any exceptions, said this is land that technically doesn't belong to us. It belonged to, this is the tribe that was here, they still exist. In many cases, they had asked permission essentially from the local indigenous community that was still around. And so sometimes they had leaders from those indigenous communities come and give a sort of blessing, if they were willing to, of this group to use that land. In the Vermont one, they had a work of art that actually the local indigenous population had created to hold a sort of center place within their liturgy. So I do think there was more than a sort of perfunctory land acknowledgement, but that there was a real attempt to come into relationship with indigenous people there, and to do some thinking about that. So, but yeah, I think it's a very interesting question about these myths of wilderness. There's a scholar by the name of William Cronon who wrote an article that became famous or infamous, depending on how you interpret it, called The Trouble with Wilderness. And so he did some, I thought, really thoughtful reflection on wilderness. I'll just share a couple of quotes, as I think it gives an indication of some things that I'm thinking about. He says, wilderness hides its unnaturalness behind a mask that is all the more beguiling because it seems so natural. As we gaze into the mirror that it holds up for us, we too easily imagine that what we behold is nature, capital N, when in fact we see the reflection of our own unexamined longings and desires. So I'd like to go a little more into examination of this in the research. He says again, wilderness is the natural, unfallen antithesis of the unnatural civilization that has lost its soul. And there is a certain belief in this, I would say, that I found in the wild churches of modern culture has gone awry, and we need to sort of return to a more simple way of living, this sort of beauty of nature. It is a place of freedom, he says, in which we can recover the true selves that we've lost to the corrupting influences of our artificial lives. Most of all, it is the ultimate landscape of authenticity, combining the sacred grandeur of the sublime with the primitive simplicity of the frontier. It is the place where we can see the world as it really is, and so know ourselves as we really are or ought to be. But the trouble with wilderness is that it quietly expresses and reproduces the very values its devotees seek to reject. The flight from history that is very nearly the core of wilderness represents the false hope of an escape from responsibility, the illusion that we can somehow wipe clean the slate of our past and return to the tabula rasa that supposedly existed before we began to leave our marks on the world. The dream of an unworked natural landscape is very much the fantasy of people who have never themselves had to work the land to make a living, urban folk for whom food comes from a supermarket or a restaurant instead of a field, and for whom the wooden houses in which they live bear no relation to the forest from which they came. Only people whose relation to the land was already alienated could hold up wilderness as a model for human life in nature, for the romantic ideology of wilderness leaves precisely nowhere for human beings actually to make their living from the land. So I think he's very critical in a sense of, maybe more critical than I would want to be, of this project of connecting to nature, but I think he asked some probing questions that I look forward to taking up in my own research. And then finally, I'll end on this this point here, the sort of feminist reflection that I'm doing on this work. I was very touched, I would say, by the feminine leadership of these communities. It was very, as a Catholic person and coming from a Catholic context, very different, of course, where you had sometimes the husbands of the women who were leading these groups sort of like scurrying around in the background, putting out cookies and setting out tablecloths and like making it possible for their wives to succeed in this sort of public thing that they were doing. The men who were participating in the communities, I would say, embraced more stereotypically feminine ways of relating. So there was a military veteran there sharing poetry about beavers, and this sort of thing that actually I found very, very touching, and sometimes crying, and a sort of space for an alternative masculinity being led by women. So I wanted to explore this theme as well. One of the resources I'm using to do this is a book by Natalie Carnes, which just came out in, I think, 2024, called Attunement. So this is Attunement, the Art and Politics of Feminist Theology. So Carnes uses this notion of niche construction, which he takes from the sciences, as a metaphor to explore strategies that women use to navigate existence within patriarchal cultures. The biological sciences use the concept of niche construction to describe the ways that organisms modify their environments. Many of you will be familiar with this, to benefit themselves and their offspring, but thereby shaping the environment in sometimes permanent and significant ways. So the emphasis is that organisms are not just passive victims of the environment, but they're able in sometimes creative ways to exert agency to change the environment. So Carnes notes that niche construction shows how creatures gain certain affordances from environments, but they also build new affordances, changing what the environment will provide in the future. So Carnes uses this concept to articulate a process that she describes as attunement, and she defines attunement as an aesthetically invested and constructively oriented mode of reading and writing. This is very text-based for her, so she says through attunement, feminists draw on affordances of a text or an artifact to build new positive affordances into the text. She says they build niches in the environments of the text, changing what the text means for a given community and transforming the text environment to be more conducive to the flourishing of the gender marginalized. And she thinks they do this specifically through attention to aesthetics. So attunement then is an act of co-creation and a niche construction that alters what she describes as the patriarchy poisoned landscape by mediating artifacts anew. So Carnes uses this term landscape in her phrase patriarchy poisoned landscape metaphorically, as I said, to talk about texts and artifacts. I would like to creatively extend her notion of attunement to speak of literal patriarchy poisoned landscapes and the ways in which the Wild Church Network represents a feminist project of mediating nature to participants anew through these spiritual practices that are very attuned to aesthetics. So a lot of it is developing the ability to pay attention, a focus on poetry, sometimes works of art. So aesthetics is very central to the Wild Church project. Nature is not neutral. Rather, as we've seen, it's always bound up with culture and myth. Many of our myths of nature in the United States have been masculine ones, so we might think again of the frontier or this sort of rugged individualism that can be associated with nature. For some, nature is chaotic, feminine, and an object to be dominated, or nature is other. It's a sort of empty resource that we can exploit for profit. And maybe for others, nature is that which is passing away and not worthy to be compared to the heavenly glories that await. So I wanted to think about the leadership of the Wild Church Network through this sort of gender lens and the advancing of more stereotypically feminine styles of leadership. The approach in all of them is very invitational. It's, in a sense, they are very strong on the fact that it's non-hierarchical. I think that there are still some hierarchies that are there, but at least the goal is for it to be non-hierarchical, non-coercive, and really an emphasis on a feeling of connection and wanting people to have an opportunity to explore that. So I think in this way, these communities reflect Carnes' notion of attunement. Instead of building niches in environments of text, the Wild Churches build niches in local environments, thereby changing what these environments mean for the local community and transforming individuals and communities to become more aware of our interdependence with other beings. And as I mentioned, this is, I think, an aesthetically invested exercise. Wild Churches cultivate the skills of paying attention to sensory experiences in nature, slowing down and learning to see in new ways. This aesthetically oriented way of proceeding in the Wild Churches aims to transform and to midwife new ways of being. So my sense with the Wild Church is that these are places of myth making. We might say for better or for worse, places of myth making. I think I'll end it there and just allow for some time for questions.
So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Feel free to at any point get up and get more food. There's plenty of food, and I'll let you field the questions.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck from the outset by the choice of Wild Churches, if they're so non-denominational. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit.
This is something that also drew me to the Wild Churches, is that it's all very theological, like a lot of the even using language like grace and nature and the sacred, how are those terms being understood? And so I asked Victoria and Valerie at the very beginning of the project, basically, what was your wrestling with using this term church? And they said that it really has been a wrestling, and they've gone back and forth on whether or not they should. So the worry is that it's too Christian sounding, and that it would be alienating. So there are some of the wild church communities that do not describe themselves as a church, but they might just use the term community, like a sacred community or something. Victoria and Valerie, I think, felt that it had enough of like symbolic resonance that it communicated to people what was going to be happening in those spaces, that they felt it could be useful. But I felt a lot of ambivalence from them around those terms. And I think it, again, comes from there's so much Christian theology that is shaping this, I think. So Victoria wrote a book as well called Church in the Wild. And so she describes herself as an edge walker, like a kind of border walker on the edge of Christianity, but definitely the Christian theology is very much there, but just being kind of refashioned, I would say, towards these ecological uses.
Can you say a little bit more about the data, like how many people are there involved, how many churches across the United States?
Yeah.
How stable is the membership? You know, I can imagine people going maybe, in the spring and then not again, or, do you have to become a permanent member? Like, what is that membership?
So there's 350 of them across the world, but mostly in North America. There's a few in Europe, primarily in Germany. So I went only to 6, and we'll try to do a few more if I can. So
do they arise spontaneously and then connect to her church organization?
Yeah, I think so. And so Victoria and Valerie envision it as this sort of organic thing that will just kind of emerge, and they don't want to be telling people they should go start wild churches, or they really value it being organic development. But they have also a center for wild spirituality, so there might be people who learn about the center and then come and want to start their own wild church. So that's part of it, but I think it seems to be sort of organic, where people might feel this urge to connect with nature and then somehow hear about the Wild Church Network. And then basically they have a website on the website where you can just register your wild church and say, like, we are now a wild church, and people can come. And and so the stability question is also really interesting, because there's a very much like an anti-institutional thrust with the wild churches. But when I spoke with Valerie and Victoria, they both said, we've always valued it being organic, but we feel that it's gotten to a point where it needs to become more institutionalized in order for it to be able to continue. And they said, like, we are not the people who can do that. We were waiting for someone to emerge who will be able to institutionalize it. But that was very interesting also for me to observe that it seems this is just an organizational reality, that at a certain point you have to have more structure in order for it to survive. And so I think there is this coming and going, or what I saw even with the website is people registering a wild church, and then I would contact them and, we're not meeting anymore, or that's kind of dissolved. So I think there is this kind of fluctuation that the ones that are maybe connected to the denominations, I think that gave them a little more of that institutional stability that maybe helped more so than the just organic group of people.
And then in terms of theology, I'm just wondering how you envision your methodology. So are these people that you interview going to be the norm for a theology that you develop, or is there kind of a presupposed theology that you're trying out on these people? It sounds to me, from what you've been saying, that it's sort of a two-way street a little bit, but I'm just curious sort of how you see the theological sort of method or your hermeneutics of how you're going to go about sort of developing something that you want to have more normative impact, I imagine.
Yeah, so I think it is a little bit of both. So my own, I guess, presupposition is that we always have presuppositions, or we have theories, and so I definitely have theories, some of which I expressed about. I think that there are implicit beliefs that we hold about the nature of the relationship between God and the world that we use to resource spiritual experiences, or to be able to experience nature as spiritual. I think I could be wrong about that. That's what I think is the case. And so partly I'm trying to test that a little bit to see, is it the case that there is this sort of, if you delve down deep enough, a theological account that is there, even if people want to deny it. But it's there, and it allows them to make sense of nature as spiritual, or is it something different altogether? So I would say that is a sort of presupposition that I bring, that I want to use this data to see, is this showing up in the survey responses, or is a way I can get to that in the interviews, and then from that to use that as a springboard to write something more normative. So my work will be, I would say, more normative. I think Helga is not really comfortable. She wants to do much more descriptive work. And so I think in our shared work, probably that will be more descriptive, but then in the work that I'm doing on my own, I want to think more about how should we think about the relationship between God and the world in order to have a sense of nature spirituality. So, yeah, does that answer? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Yosin.
Yeah, thank you. My question builds on what was just being asked.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you serving with this? Are you serving the community by spelling out their thinking and then suggesting something more sustainable, or are you serving our dearly beloved Mother, the Roman Catholic Church? You know, to say, listen, we're forgetting something, and these people do that. Yes. So who are you serving?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's also a mix. So I think what I hope will be a role that I play with the Wild Church communities is as a generative interlocutor that can help them also to think through more deeply what they are doing, and hopefully in a way that is positive for them and beneficial and generative. But I also think, and again, as I mentioned, many of these people are former Roman Catholics. And so I think they have experiences that are worth listening to, and especially those of us who are more part of the institution, to go out to where they are and to hear what it is why does this mean something to them, or what is it that they're finding here that they felt that they weren't able to find in an institutional context. And so also that, and then, yeah, I think I've shared in other spaces before that I have, even in my own family, people who have left Christianity and would say that they basically practice a sort of nature spirituality. And so maybe I think underneath all of it, I just want to understand why my brother is doing what he's doing. That's maybe sort of at the root of it, but I think it can, if I put it in academic speak, it can also serve these other goals, I hope. But I think, I mean, again, one of my presuppositions is that all of our academic work is coming from a personal place most of the time. So I try to just foreground mine. Yeah, Kristen?
You know, that was exactly what my question was going to get at. I guess I was curious about the mutual clarification, like a two-way street, whether any of the survey questions included not only what drew you to this Wild Church, but like reasons for exit, or what were lacunae, in terms of what you just turned to in answering Yo's. I don't know if, that's relevant in the more descriptive data collection or interview stage for
I
you?
do have a question about, basically, to the extent that they feel comfortable sharing about their sort of journey with more institutionalized religion, and so a space for them to share, to the extent they feel comfortable, about were they part of something else and then they left, and what was the reasoning in that. And it's also something I think I'll be able to get more at in the interviews as well when I do those. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, Anatana and then Kristen. Yeah.
I was curious about the selection of location. To what degree the locations had to have certain elements to them? The pictures that you showed were mostly forest kinds of environments, which makes sense in North America and Europe. Do you know if all of these wild churches are located more in wooded areas? Do they need to have some kind of a water source that's associated with them?
They're really open, and so both Victoria and Valerie said, like, you can do this anywhere. So they famously say, like, even in a parking lot, like, you can find a way of kind of connecting with, like, the crows that are there. Or and so they said they do have, especially for people who are looking for more accessible, maybe there's mobility challenges. They do have some that are less challenging, driving through a mud road to get to the forest, that are trying to appeal to make it as inclusive as possible. So they're really a range, and so there's some in Hawaii. I was wanting to go visit those on the beach, and so I think it's really just like, where can you, even if it's a small patch of grass in Wellesley, if you feel that that's a place where you can make a connection with nature, that's really the focus, and less specifically on any topographical kind of elements. Yeah. Kristen?
I was struck by a similar discussion that happened like in the 70s and 80s with like goddess spirituality and Wicca and witchcraft and some of these movements. And I'm curious, kind of two parts. Is one is like, how do you see these movements as similar but also different than some of that? But also, are most of the people in these churches part of kind of that generation that came of age in the 70s and 80s, or are they more of a younger generation?
Yeah, so it's also a mix. Definitely there is an element of, I would say, older white hippies who are coming to these places, and maybe it's connecting with these earlier movements. So that's for sure there. But I think there's also younger people that I saw, young families in some cases. Oftentimes it's connected to a sense of like ecological apocalypse, in a sense, like something really wrong is happening and we need to connect this to our spirituality if we want to make a difference in anything. We can't just rely on the corporations to do something for us. So when I spoke with more of the younger people, I think it was more coming from that sense. But there was for sure a theme of Mother Earth, Gaia, Goddess, as part of the kind of feminist project, I would say, referring to nature as mother and these sorts of things. That was for sure there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
As an older white hippie, I'd like to say that I really dug your presentation. And I do use that word. But what dawned on me, I'm a student, so I don't speak a lot of the professors speak here, but what dawned on me is that some of the practices remind me of some of the practices of the mystics who brought in natural elements. And I'm wondering if some of the practices that you saw with these wild churches or that you've studied incorporate some of those practices of the mystics, such as contemplative practices and things like that.
There's definitely, in both the writings of Victoria Lortz and then also the wild church communities, a very explicit connection made to the mystics within the Christian tradition, partly as a sense of, I think, validating what they're doing as kind of edge walkers, that like mystics occupy this uncomfortable space institutionally sometimes, but that they can still offer something that's generative to the institution. And so partly it's a sort of identification with mystical practice as a marginalized practice, but that one that is still valuable. But then also drawing specifically from some of, I would say more so the theologies is what I saw from the mystics, mostly Christian mystics, but not all. But yeah, so I didn't necessarily see so much in the practice, but definitely the theology there. Yeah. Oh, Andrea. Actually, sorry. Yes. Raise your hand. Yeah.
If you were to ask those who attend the wild churches, would they say that there's any sort of expectation for how their experience of their liturgies is supposed to shape how they live in the rest of their lives? Is there a shared moral code or political activism that correlates with this participation?
That's a really good question. I think it's again a mix, but what I predominantly saw was a more left progressive politics, a sort of despair about the current moment, and a sense that what's happening in these churches is working against some of those forces, and so I would say, that sometimes that the focus was really on the spirituality, but I think the hope there was that it would also influence how people go out and act. But there wasn't always a very explicit, like, now you should all go and recycle, or like now you should all go and do XYZ. But the focus was really on cultivating a space where people could experience connection with nature. But I think, again, the implicit belief is that if we do that, people will change how they live. And so that's one of the things we're kind of interested in looking at with the data.
But it's just that one domain, the relationship with nature, not other domains of human life. So much.
I think also interpersonal relationships, maybe to a certain extent, of striving to be non-coercive, striving to be sort of accepting of others in all of their wildness and complexity. And so I think maybe to that extent, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for research. I was wondering whether you got the sense that the members of these communities, the wild churches, tried to change where they were before. Let's say if they were part of an established community, ecclesial community, if they tried and because they failed, they tried now something new. Because it's interesting that. So what is the story before? Because it's not easy to start something completely new. You need to have a strong motivation. Then you need to find the connections. Then you need to have the human and intellectual and relational energy to do that. So I was wondering whether there is a backstory that now led them to what they experience is the last resort, or their only way out to promote something that they were longing for.
I heard this most explicitly among the leaders of the communities, so I'm not sure about necessarily each of the individual members, but for several of the leaders that I spoke to, they went to some sort of Christian seminary, and so several of them expressed frustration with the gender dynamics of not feeling heard or feeling that ecology or ecological concerns were something that was sort of just gestured at in traditional institutional spaces, but not seriously taken on board. And so I think that those were the two frustrations that I heard the most was we need to do something radical to address the ecological situation that we're in, and Christian churches are failing to do that, and we want to start this new thing that's going to be more radical and actually make a difference. And then also the kind of gender frustration of feeling like actually the church is not that interested in hearing from women as much as different denominations might say that they are. It's not the case, and so we will start a space where women's voices are at the center. So I think those are the primary ones that I've seen. But sometimes I should say there were also people there who were still part of active participation in a denomination, and then this was sort of a supplement to that. So many of the wild churches would meet on a Saturday or like a Sunday afternoon, specifically to allow people to go to their regular church and then come and have this sort of alternative spiritual practice that they felt nourished their other spirituality. Megan, did you have your hand raised?
I do have a question. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I was curious if your time in these wild churches and your time studying about what you're studying has impacted your spirituality or your spirituality with your own kids.
Yeah, that's a great question. For sure it has. I think I've thought a lot about the gender question. I mean, I'm always sort of thinking about that as a feminist theologian, but how much it impacted me to hear these women sharing and expressing leadership in their communities, taking leadership, and that how moving that was to me, and then also seeing men being willing to embody alternative forms of masculinity that I hadn't seen in many ecclesial spaces. So that I would say that I don't know if it changed me, but more as something that I hold in my heart still as something that I have appreciated from the communities, because I think I had these intuitions already. With my own kids, it's tricky, I would say. So, I wrestle inside of myself, and maybe other parents can relate as well, to wanting to value kids as kids and allow them to be kids, and they are not like constituted to sit still for an hour in mass, and so wanting to not just be constantly shushing them. So I noticed that was a frustration that I had in myself when I came back to mass after being in the wild churches, was feeling like I don't like the kind of relational dynamic that is established here, where I'm just constantly frustrated and expressing that to them because they're just being normal kids. On the other hand, I think it's good for them to learn, and it's good for them to have expectations put upon them that you can practice sitting still for a time, and maybe you can't the whole time, but you're still welcomed into this community where adults are, and you can. That's how you learn to be an adult, is like. So it's sort of that balance of like appreciating where they are, and that's normal, but also wanting to give some boundary. I would give a little more boundaries maybe than what you see in the wild church, where it is really like whatever you want to do, go do it. And I think for myself as a parent, I have a little more like, well, we also teach them as parents like what they need to do to be successful adults. So that's the wrestling, I would say, inside of myself that I'm still working on. So.
Okay, please join me in thanking Dr. Megan.